For today's episode, we will cover a special inhibitory neuron called the Parvalbumin Interneuron. We will cover a recent article by Fujima et al., just released in late August 2025 in Cell Press, a top journal for medicine and neuroscience, titled Parvalbumin Interneurons in the Insular Cortex Control, Social Familiarity, and Emotion Recognition. Now, if you know about Cell Press, they have many different types of journals. This one's called Cell Reports. However, with all of these journals, Cell Press really has a huge benefit, in my opinion, because they release a graphical abstraction, which is easy to follow, kind of a graphical summary of the article, and some highlights, 3 to 4, typically 4 bullet points. It is almost like a cover letter for the article. I love this page because it also provides room for notes. I'll just read the highlights, the 4 bullet points from this article now. A subset of insular Parvalbumin interneurons exhibits increased activity during social interaction. Second one, inhibiting Parvalbumin interneurons prevents the loss of preference for familiar peers. Third, inhibiting Parvalbumin interneurons impairs the preference for stressed peers. And finally, the fourth, Parvalbumin interneurons modulate pyramidal neuron activity related to social target preference. And just a side note on the pyramidal neurons, these are excitatory. So we have a dance here between inhibitory, the Parvalbumin, and the pyramidal, the excitations. We will recap several critical areas here: the medial prefrontal cortex, the insular cortex, the default mode network, and remember the inhibition problem with the autistic phenotype, the excitation and inhibition balance. In large part, the Parvalbumin interneuron is helping this. It has a role in this. With autism, there's high excitation and or low inhibition. And for those really dedicated here, this cell type has roles in the basal ganglia. We've covered the basal ganglia in several, maybe 4 or 5 episodes. Huge problem with the autistic phenotype. And we will once again get into the Tsang et al. Article released last year from UCLA on 6 weeks old. These are human infants, 6 weeks old study. We will parse this out and add layers to this even more. Because something autism research, in my opinion, fails to do is expand on these good articles that are released and are meaningful. What are we going to do with these articles now? And finally, we will have a brief recap on a protein, CNTNAP2, which is heavily involved in autism research and plays a big function here with developing the autistic phenotype. We've covered this in episodes 4 or 5 and with Dr. Hannah Stevens. But first, a word about Daylight Computer Company and Chroma Light Devices. I have something exciting. I want to introduce a product unlike any other product available. A highlight is the product from Daylight Computer Company created their product based on these factors. The Daylight computer is completely blue light free. It has no flicker. Short wavelength flicker is extremely harmful for our eyes and downstream biology. Light flicker is constantly turning our central nervous system on and off. Essentially, it is like going to a light switch and repeatedly turning it on and off. The problem is, blue light and LED light does this. And it is so rapid, you cannot even perceive this in real time. The daylight computer is the lowest stimulation and foremost for sensory-sensitive users. It is no question that the alternative product, especially when used at night, do not address or consider this in their product. It is so toxic to human biology. Big tech corporations have patents on how their short wavelength implicate the human nervous system. And a bonus, despite daylight computer not having backlight, it is very functional for outdoor use. And of course, increased sunlight is always preferred. I am happy to offer a discount for the daylight computer. You can use the code AUTISM for a $50 off discount. Again, use the code AUTISM and the discount code for $50 off. See the link in the show notes to Daylight Computer Company, or just give it a quick search in your internet browser. Use the code AUTISM for $50 off. I would like to mention Chroma, lights designed for humans. Chroma, a Seattle-based innovator founded by ex-NASA and Air Force engineer Michael Shapiro, is on a mission to enhance physical and mental health with purpose-built devices, unlocking peak human health, cognitive function, and performance. Shapiro launched Chroma to restore the natural light lost to screens in indoor living, and delivers faster recovery, sharper minds, and better sleep. Their products hit hard. The Iron Forge speeds muscle repair with red and near-infrared light, while the Skylight mimics sunlight to boost sleep and energy. A standout, the Forge lamp is a portable gem that fires 660 nanometer and 850 nanometer light to energize mitochondria and heal tissues on the go. Remember the 4 red light chromophores on cytochrome C oxidase, frequently talked about in the podcast. This is why their products are built with military-grade durability that have lasting impact. Chroma's tech fuses precision and power. Gallium titride power supplies, smaller, cooler, and stronger than silicone, provide flicker-free light that's easy on the eyes. High-powered LEDs target key wavelengths for skin, tissue, and cellular health, with smart heat management for the lasting impact. Every design decision Chroma makes serves a purpose: to create devices that are precise, durable, and effective for improving human life. Remember, humans use different wavelengths of light for different functions of life. Remember when I ask, what do you think light is? Chroma designs with our biology in mind, from sleep aids and wound healing to mitochondrial energy, full body lights and blue light blocking glasses. They are US made and Chroma ships globally and accepts FSA and HSA payments. Use Autism at checkout for a 10% off discount. That's Autism at checkout for a 10% off discount. Okay, the medial prefrontal cortex. Remember, it's medial, meaning middle. So evolutionarily, it came on board before the lateral, or basically before the outer surfaces, the sides and the top of the prefrontal cortex. Remember the human head, our brain, above the eyes. If you draw a line back from the eyes to the back of the head, the occipital lobe, our heads extend up and full, like no other species. So the medial prefrontal cortex, it is a huge area for the internal calculators that we discuss. It includes decision making. It considers risk versus reward and future planning, conflict monitoring, and error detection. A huge way the living organism learns, grows, and evolves is updating from errors, making errors, and then correcting them. This is huge here in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is basically adaptive responses. We have a whole episode on this, allowing the living organism to adapt, shift, utilize healthy skills in real time. Remember, the autism and medial prefrontal cortex, whenever we are making healthy choices, when we are utilizing our skills as a living organism, the medial prefrontal cortex, and specifically the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, lead the way. They orchestrate all of these downstream movements and behaviors that control even thoughts and feelings. When we do not adaptively respond, our lower brain area overtakes the medial prefrontal cortex. It kind of shuts it out, pushes it away. So with adaptive responses, this is huge in autism. Also, social cognition, which will be covered in the main article for today, and self-referential thinking, self-referential thoughts. That intense dreamlike state autistics have. A specific region of the ACC, which is in the medial prefrontal cortex. The ACC is just a little subdivision here. More on that in a future episode, how this area is huge for those dreamlike states and visual thinking. So you ought to be able to see some emotional regulation also happening here in this medial prefrontal cortex area. So let's discuss the insula. The insular cortex has several subdivisions as well, subregions. Specifically for today, we'll talk more about the anterior insula. Now remember, the insula is a central hub for analyzing emotional brain states, thoughts and feelings even, bodily signals, those physiological responses like heart rate and how you're breathing, if you're sweating, how your gut feels. It's receiving all of that data as well. And it's also incorporating the environment, what is going on the outside. The anterior insula integrates interoceptive signals with those emotional and cognitive information that contributes to these subjective experiences. It's involved with things like disgust or empathy, and even some anxiety. Whenever those subregions overtake the medial prefrontal cortex, the insula will register that. Those physiological responses happening in real time will be salient. And if you remember the salience network, the insula, especially this anterior part, is heavily involved in the so-called salience network, which is huge in that UCLA study, and is huge in everybody's life. An interesting consideration is the anterior insula also registers social cues, specifically with trust and fairness. Remember Katie Asher coming on when she says that Houston can detect evil at high rates and with high accuracy. This is part of intuition. Autistics have an outstanding intuition because of these brain regions that we're discussing today. And the interoceptive functions. The interoceptive functions is a good way of thinking about this. What is happening on our insides? Okay, we should talk about the Parvalbumin Interneurons. Remember, basically in the central nervous system, there are three main types of neurons: sensory neuron, motor neuron, and interneuron. So the Parvalbumin interneurons can be seen as abbreviated as PVIN in a lot of research. They are found in various brain regions, including the cortex, these areas that we're discussing today, the hippocampus, which is large part for memory, and the basal ganglia. So with the inhibition, of course they are GABAergic, G-A-B-A, GABA. What's interesting about these PVINs is the morphology, and they're often so-called basket or chandelier type cells, which means they have extensive axonal arborization, which aids in the synapses. These Parvalbumin cells provide a strong inhibition. If you think about the level of strength, or if you want to layer these or rank these with excitation cells or GABAergic cells, these Parvalbumins are strong, and they are fast spiking with rapid action potential. In the gamma oscillation or the gamma waves, this is as fast spiking as you can get. This is because it provides precise timing in neural responses. It synchronizes the excitation inhibition. It helps modulate and control behaviors. So of course there are some space and time domains here, because the living organism needs to adapt, respond, and move throughout its environment with great efficiency for those survival instincts, for those goal-directed instincts. And these PVINs are really zooming in and showing how this is being conducted in our biology. It's very fascinating. Okay, let's go into that study. So the methodology here is very important to look at when you're parsing out scientific literature. So the researchers used microendoscopic calcium imaging and chemogenetic manipulation in mice. Yes, this study is going to be done on mice. In neuroscience, there are kind of manipulations that a model that people can follow. So their animals, their subjects are very similar from study to study, supposedly. The calcium imaging enabled real-time observations of the neuronal activity during social interactions, while the chemogenetic tools allowed for selective inhibition of the PVINs, and that allowed them to assess their functional role. Very fascinating. So the study found that the PVINs with the social and emotional processing are essential for encoding social familiarity. So distinguishing family versus novel conspecifics. Remember, these are mice. I'm reminded of our oxytocin episode with the two different types of oxytocin, magnocellular and parvocellular, and how each one of these types of oxytocin kind of helps with the parental bonding versus the peer-to-peer bonding. This is exactly that. The study also shows emotional recognition. So responding to a stressed peer's emotional state. And a specific subset of these PVINs show increased activity during peer interactions. And this is highlighting their role in processing social and emotional cues. Everything that we just kind of outlined before we get into the study is kind of showing that with the medial prefrontal cortex, the ACC, the insula, and I've added in the oxytocin now. Very fascinating. Very much aligned with the autistic phenotype. So some of the behavioral effects of these PVIN whenever with these inhibition cells. So they disrupted the mice's ability to reduce preference for familiar peers and increase interactions with stressed conspecifics. And this indicates that the PVINs regulate context-dependent social behaviors. Context-dependent here is so good. and this modulates pyramidal neurons. We've discussed pyramidal neurons during the spindle neuron episode. So this interaction with PVINs and the pyramidal neurons, specifically in the anterior insula, allows the living organism to maintain an proper excitation-inhibition balance for adaptive social exploration. I love this stuff. Stuff like this is why I do the podcast. PVINs also dynamically adjust for the pyramidal responses to ensure appropriate neural circuit activity. These PVINs are in large part just orchestrating. And it's allowing the living organism to detect social salience, more of that salience, and processing emotional states. So good. Dysfunction in this balance impairs the ability to prioritize novel stimuli or respond to emotional cues, that social cues, such as the stress in others, and providing a cellular mechanism for the social cognition deficits. Okay, the Tsang et al. Article, once again. Salience network connectivity is altered in 6 weeks old infants at heightened likelihood for developing autism. Now, sometimes in autism research, there are high likelihood groups and atypical likelihood groups. That's what this is saying. This was released in April 2024. This was done on 53 infants, 24 of which are high likelihood for autism due to having an older sibling with an already autism diagnosis, which is very questionable, even. It's hard to parse that out. And 29 at typical likelihood with no family history. And they used resting state functional magnetic resonance imaging, RS fMRI, at 6 weeks of age during natural sleep. The focus here was on the salience network connectivity, particularly the interactions with sensory motor regions. Now, the sensory motor regions is at the top middle of your head. So if you think about those distal connections, sometimes even with the midbrain, the mesencephalon, or these subcortical areas, that's a large distance. A large part of the sensory motor region involves sensory processing and movement. And then the prefrontal regions, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex. So the behavioral assessments here, because they're just 6 weeks old, at 12 months, included the Autism Observation Scale for infants, AOSI, and the Early Social Communication Scale, an infant-toddler sensory profile. This is helping evaluate the likelihood of and the connection of the autistic phenotype to these subgroups, the likelihood versus the typical. So just right away, the key finding here is infants at high likelihood for autism show stronger salience network connectivity with those sensory motor regions compared to the typical developing group that showed stronger salience network connectivity with the prefrontal regions, including, you guessed it, the medial prefrontal cortex. So there's a trade-off here. They're suggesting that there was an inverse relationship between the salience network connectivity to sensory motor and prefrontal regions. In the high likelihood infants with the stronger sensory motor connection had weaker salience network to prefrontal connectivity. In addition, they found that the salience network connectivity patterns for these at 6 weeks old predicted behavioral outcomes at 1 year old, and the stronger salience network sensory motor connectivity is associated with increased sensory over-responsiveness, which is very common. You can see this with the autistic phenotype. See Autism and Sensory Processing, the 2 episodes on that from spring of 2025. In contrast, the stronger salience network to the prefrontal connectivity with specifics to the medial prefrontal cortex, predicted better social attention skills, such as just initiating joint attention. And this is all relevant for a future episode where we parse out the precuneus and dive a little bit deeper into visual thinking and the default mode network. This is providing a bit of a foundation. So tying in previous research on this Salience network kind of dysfunction with the autistic phenotype. This is consistent, and a 2013 study reported hyperconnectivity with the Salience network in children with autism and achieved 78% accuracy in classifying autism versus typical based off of this Salience network pattern. In addition, a 2016 study linked increased Salience network connectivity with the sensory processing areas, and a different study in 2024 also found the reduced Salience network connectivity between a rostral, prefrontal cortex, and the left cerebellum in autism, alongside increased connectivity between the right supramarginal gyrus and the temporal regions, which linked these changes to deficits in self-awareness and emotional processing. Some other worthy mentions here with the anterior insula. A 2010 study found that reduced anterior insula activation correlates with alexithymia. Alexithymia is the inability to define, recognize your feelings. And this is kind of common with the autistic phenotype. Hyper-responsiveness to adversive stimuli was also found in the insular cortex, suggesting altered sensory emotional integration, which is potentially driven by these PVIN cells that we've discussed today. The PVINs in the insular cortex, so reduced PVINs in the insular cortex is observed in autism mouse models, for instance with the CNT-NAP2 knockout studies. And this leads to impaired inhibition control, which disrupts social processing, which is very much in line with the Fujima study. So since we mentioned it, this CNT-NAP2 is very worthy of mentioning here. This organizes neural circuits, most specifically at the synaptic level. And also remember in previous episodes, episode 4 or 5, neurorexin and neuroligin, those pre- and postsynaptic proteins and genes. CNT-NAP also is involved with cell adhesion with neurons and glia. And it regulates migration, dendritic arborization. Remember some density issues for the autistic phenotype, and specifically 2 areas of the dorsal striatum, the input area of the basal ganglia, our go, no-go area. In autism, the dorsal striatum has a lot of dendrites, more ability to activate and be overwhelmed. Dr. Hannah Stevens studies this. And also the dendritic issues with the thalamus. Remember autism, sensory map, and serotonin. The thalamus in the autistic phenotype typically isn't pruned correctly. CNT-NAP2 also, and this is huge, balances excitation and inhibition. This is huge in autism. Remember the Rubinstein and Merzenich paper in 2003. This paper was released. It's highly cited, like 3,200 citations. And Mike Merzenich it's kind of a leader for neuroplasticity, how living organisms are constructed, what makes us who we are. Now something relevant here, because we mentioned the oxytocin connection, or the similarities, I should say. I don't know if it's related. and this ability to understand social cues and have social familiarity with family versus peers. The medial prefrontal cortex role with social cognition. Remember I mentioned this. There are consistent findings with a reduction of PVINs and a hypofunction PVINs in the medial prefrontal cortex with autism. A 2017 post-mortem study, these are excellent types of studies, report 38 to 70% reduction of PVINs in the prefrontal regions in autism, which correlate with the social deficits. Now, 38 to 70% reduction is a wide range, but significant. In these mouse models, remember we can standardize kind of these behavior models. We can manipulate animals to have similar deficits, be it autism or mania, depression, etc. In autism mouse models, there's a PVIN hypofunction in the medial prefrontal cortex that contributes to rigid thinking. Okay, that's huge in autism and often kind of hard to observe from the outside. These autism diagnoses, these assessments, have a hard time picking that up. And also impaired social behavior. However, optogenetic, remember Carl Diceroth, optogenetic stimulation of these medial prefrontal cortex, these PVIN cells, enhances sociability. In other words, they can kind of rescue these social deficits. And lastly, on the theory of mind thing. Remember, Sir Simon Baron-Cohen released this in 1985, and it kind of provided a foundation, a direction forward about how we should perceive the autistic phenotype. However, there's a lot of errors with that. There are a lot of errors. If you read the Cantor paper, those case studies, they knew exactly what was happening in the environment. And they were mostly young, boys, 3, 4, 5 years old. Remember, the girls were a little bit older, 7, 8, 9, or so forth. But they knew exactly what was happening. I don't want us to underestimate, overlook the interoception here of the autistic phenotype and this intuition, this ability to process sensory, including within the self, including being able to recognize what is happening. This is a trade-off here. The sensory trade-off versus the social trade-off. The autistic phenotype is very comfortable within themselves. This is a large part what is happening. The biology that gives us autism allows us to be comfortable within ourselves. This has massive benefits for learning and understanding. Do people understand that? We are going to dive into this in great detail in a future episode with the visual thinking, because these regions are involved, and how autistic brain is similar to AI, how there's massive amounts of catalogs for different categories. Massive amounts of information being absorbed. This is the autistic phenotype. This is what autism is. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. You can identify it as From the Spectrum, Finding Superpowers with Autism name. We can have any discussion about autism that you wish. I very much appreciate your conversation. You can contact me by email, info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. You can check out the YouTube page for all the videos, shorts, and clips as well. Don't forget to check out Daylight Computer Company and Chroma Light Devices. These are products made for humans. They put humans over anything. And I very much appreciate that mission. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.